Hey class, I wanted to do a quick video to explain what's happening with the lab notebooks this quarter. It's different than previous quarters, and so since we didn't have class on Monday, I wanted to make a quick little intro thing for you. I'm sure you've looked at the syllabus already, and so you've seen that the lab notebook is actually a valuable part of your overall grade. And I want to make sure that you have the guidance you need to have a good notebook. So this is a couple examples from past quarters of what a notebook could look like. You would have your name on the front. I'm covering up the previous student's name. But you want to make sure you've got a notebook like this that is a permanently bound. It's not a spiral. There's no like perforation where you can rip out pages. And you do want to do your notebook in ink. If we wanted to look at an example, let's go to just a random one. So here is the sulfur group lab. So this is week 8. This is looking far in the future. But I got this student's notebook because they did a pretty good job. So if you've read the syllabus, you know that you always start with safety and waste at the top. So this one, all the solutions could go down the drain. There were no special safety notes. But we should have a couple safety notes up there. Then a flowchart is essentially a pictorial representation of how you're going to go about doing the lab. This student used little blocks and arrows. They came up with some symbolic language that worked for them. They also stapled in the actual procedure that is in a PDF we'll look at in a moment. And that's allowed as far as I'm concerned. As long as it's permanently attached to the notebook, it's part of the notebook. So there's the safety, the flow diagram. So in the flow chart, you can see we've got the different chemical compounds we're going to be using. Then we have the questions that are being answered. There's a lot of different ways that you can organize this. They decided to do flow, then questions, then data. And the important thing is that you number the questions so I can kind of keep track of them. They wrote down 4.2, but then they didn't do it. They skipped some problems. After you have questions, you've got your data table, and the data table needs to be in the notebook blank before you come to class. They don't have many chemical reactions written down. So that's an example. That was a little bit sparse. Let's look at another one real quick. So here's another notebook. Has all the dates. Let's look at, this person doesn't have sulfur. Let's look at another notebook. Okay, so again, a nice table of contents. We're going to go look at the sulfur group again, just for comparison of how different notebooks look similar and different. And again, there's a lot of flexibility as long as you have all of the information necessary in there. So here's another example of the sulfur lab. Safety, really obviously at the top. Waste. They had a little flow chart that they did for thinking about the process they were going to do. That's really nice. Not necessary, but it helped them frame their thinking. Then they've got their flow chart. A little bit different. They have better artistic skills than I have, but they drew out really nice pictures to kind of give them this flow. And a flow chart is really pictures and words, right? And it's just so you don't have to go back and constantly read the procedure, right? You can really clearly see 4 drops DI water, right? It gives you a really nice, clean way to think about it. This person also put their questions answered inside of their flowchart. So as they did part A, they wrote down the answer to one of the questions. As they did part B, they wrote down one of the answers to the question. And that's fine as long as you're also labeling the answers, so that way I know which questions I'm looking at in there. They did some nice color coding as well. Their flowchart's in black, the questions they answer are in blue. And that was for the part test 1. Here's for test 2, test 3, test 4, some additional questions afterwards. I don't like scribbles like this. When you make a mistake, it's really valuable to have it so you can still see what you wrote. so that way you know what mistake you made and you don't make the mistake again. Again, they didn't label their questions. It's nice if you number the questions, and we'll talk about how you do that in a moment. Here's their last test, the chemical reactions, and the question they answered. And again, a nice little data table with all the data that they observed. And again, the data table is there before you start lab, and then you fill in the data as you're doing lab. Now, in order to put all of this in, how do you get your notebook and all of this information? What are these question numbers that I'm talking about? Well, let's take a look at some other resources. So here's our LabPal page. This is actually the one for this quarter as well. We've got a couple important safety notes at the top. We've got our class time. We've got my Zoom link if you want to meet by Zoom. Otherwise, you can just come to office hours. The important part here is, so we're on our week 1 information. This is kind of next week more than this week because we didn't have class on Monday. We've got our syllabus. We've got our lab safety. We've got our day 1. And then this is the part that we want to pay attention to for doing the notebook, is to prepare for the BCN lab. We're actually doing the BCN lab in our next class on Monday, so it's important to look at this. And we've got 2 different pieces that will help us do this. First is the prep guide, and if you scroll down, you can see all of the prep guides down here in the files. And we're going to look at the BCN prep guide by downloading it and opening it. In the BCN prep guide, you can see all of the essential information we need for doing lab. Again, color-coded. Anything written in black is instructions. Anything written in green is valuable information. Blue are questions you should answer in your notebook. And then red is safety hazards. That should be written at the top of your notebook each week. So we'll have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 tests that we're going to do, 5 chemical reactions. The hydrogen phosphate test is just one thing, and the procedure is relatively straightforward. We put 2 drops of the solution we're testing, 1 drop of sulfuric acid, and 2 drops of ammonium molybdate, and mix. If it turns yellow, we've got hydrogen phosphate. If it stays clear, we don't have hydrogen phosphate. So that's really all we're going to do, where our test solution is going to be several different things, but that's what we're going to do. For this, we should write down a balanced reaction for each of the things we're doing. And then there's a couple questions we should answer in our notebook, and notice it's question 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, so that's how we number our questions that we're answering in the notebook. Here, the oxalate test is broken into 2 parts, part A and part B. Part A, we're just taking our test solution, which is, again, a series of things. We're adding calcium chloride and we're mixing. That's it. After we do that mixing, we've got some things to think about and some reactions to write down, some questions to answer. Precipitation reactions, solubility values. Here's a suggestion of where to look them up. And then kind of a prediction of what we expect to see before we do the lab. And then we go on to part B for that oxalate test. Using the tubes that had precipitate, we had some acetic acid, and we see if the precipitate dissolves or not. If the precipitate does not dissolve, that means we've got oxalate. After we finish that, after we write down our flow diagram for that, we've got some questions and some useful information for that as well. So we've got write down the acid-base reaction, something to think about. We've got our different questions we're answering. And we've got test 3, same thing, test 4, same thing. So each week when we're doing our notebook, we're going to end up with 4 to 6 different things, different tests we're doing, because some of them break into 2 parts. And in those 4 to 6 different things that we're doing, we're going to end up with 16 to 24 different chemical reactions to write down, because we want to write down a chemical reaction for each of our test solutions. Now, if you're wondering, from this PDF, you're going to write things into your notebook, But if you want a little extra hint as to whether you're doing things correctly or not at the beginning, that's where this other tool comes in. So we've got the BCN Prep Lab Guide Check. So this is not worth any points, but it is essentially a LabPal version of the notebook, of the PDF, and of what you're putting in the notebook. So this, I don't check this. This is just for you to check if what you're doing in the notebook is correct with a couple little hints. So for a parallel, here's test 1 hydrogen phosphate, 2 drops of our test solution, 1 drop of sulfuric acid, 2 drops of the ammonium molybdate, and mix. Hot water bath, yellow precipitate, exact same thing we were just looking at in the PDF. And then it's got, this is where it's useful. So here is one of the questions, and you can check your work beforehand by doing it in LabPal, but you need to write it in your notebook. I only grade what's in your notebook. So this allows you to check if what you're doing in your notebook is correct, essentially making sure you're going to get your points. A couple other questions, again, checks. Sometimes there's things like this. So here is the oxalates test. We're doing the solution. Here's part A and part B. 2 drop solution, 1 drop calcium chloride precipitate. You need to write down the chemical reaction of what will happen with hydrogen phosphate upon the addition of calcium chloride. You should write down a calcium hydrogen phosphate precipitation reaction. And then you should write down all 4 reactions that could happen. This is just going to test one of those 4, but you want to write down all 4 with the solubility values that you can get from Wikipedia. And again, this is a tool to help make sure what you're doing in the notebook is correct. And it goes through all of them. Test 4, Test 5, Test 7, Test 8. The question numbering is different. I've been working on making sure the question numbering ends up the same. So if you do either the LabPal numbering or the PDF numbering, you'll be fine either way. But doing that numbering is beneficial. For me, not for you as much, but also good for you to look back in the future. We'll talk more about this on our first day of lab on next Monday, but you should have a significant portion of the BCN prep done before that class because we're going to do the BCN lab that day. So hopefully this helps you feel confident as you start working on your notebook. If you have any questions, please come to office hours before lab because our first lab on Monday is going to be really busy. Okay. You can also email me, but come by office hours, and I'll see you all soon.